Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
After teaching high school biology for over 30 years, I was looking forward to spending my retirement years in peace, tending to my little slice of heaven, 3 acres of wooded land that had been in my family for generations. When my grandmother passed, she left me this beautiful piece of property with towering oak trees, maples that turned fiery red in autumn, and a small creek that babbled through the southeastern corner. It was my sanctuary, my place to connect with nature and remember her. I had grand plans to build a modest cabin there someday, but I was content to keep it natural, a small forest oasis in our increasingly developed town. I had the misfortune of living in the Cedar Hills subdivision, where the homeowners association ruled with an iron fist. My actual home was subject to their rules, but my wooded lot, which was a separate property about half a mile away, was outside their jurisdiction, or so I thought. It started with a letter in my mailbox. Dear resident, we are pleased to inform you that the Cedar Hills HOA has approved plans for a new community orchard. Your wooded lot has been selected for this prestigious development. I nearly choked on my morning coffee. Selected? It was my property. I immediately called the HOA office. I demanded an explanation about the ridiculous letter claiming they were taking my wooded lot for an orchard. The HOA representative cheerfully told me about their exciting development plans for an exclusive community orchard for Cedar Hills residents. When I explained that the land belonged to me, that I had the deed and it was private property outside their jurisdiction, the representative suggested that I had misunderstood my ownership rights. According to their records, they claimed the land was designated for community use in the original subdivision planning. I protested that I had paid taxes on that land for decades, and my grandmother owned it before me. The representative simply suggested I check my paperwork again and mentioned that the board meeting to finalize the orchard plans was scheduled for next Tuesday if I wanted to attend. I was furious but not worried. I had the deed after all. I spent the next few days gathering all my documentation, property tax receipts, and even old photographs of my grandmother on the land. When Tuesday came, I arrived at the meeting armed with my evidence, only to find they had already moved ahead with their plans. The HOA president, a woman in her 40s with a perpetual frown, was showing off architectural renderings of a manicured orchard with a small members-only pavilion. The HOA president was proudly explaining how the community orchard would increase property values by at least 15% and that they had already contracted with Evergreen Landscaping to begin clearing what she described as the overgrown trees. I stood up, my hand shaking, and interrupted to explain that the overgrown land was my private property, showing the deed I had brought with me. The president smiled coldly and claimed they had documentation showing the land was meant to be communal space, suggesting my deed was outdated. She held up a paper that looked suspiciously new. When I asked to see the document, she refused, stating it wasn't available for public examination and that the board had already verified its authenticity. Another board member, a balding man, jumped in to inform me that clearing would begin the next day, regardless of my feelings on the matter, claiming the community had spoken. When I questioned whether there had even been a vote, the HOA president dismissively stated that the board represented the community and attempted to move on to the next agenda item. I left that meeting in shock. How could they possibly think they could just take my land? The next morning I drove to my wooded lot and found bulldozers already there. 2 massive oak trees, at least a century old, were already on the ground. I parked my car across the entrance to block more equipment and walked up to the foreman. I demanded they stop immediately, telling the foreman this was private property and they were trespassing. The foreman looked uncomfortable and radioed someone. Minutes later, a sleek black SUV pulled up and the HOA president stepped out. The HOA president smugly remarked that she had expected me to interfere, declaring that this was community progress and that my trees were their legacy now. When I accused her of theft and insisted she had no right to the land, she claimed they had all the rights they needed and ordered the workers to continue. She then threatened me with fines of $200 per day if I obstructed the development, even suggesting they might put a lien on my house. She condescendingly asked if this was really the hill I wanted to die on as a retired teacher and suggested I go home and enjoy my golden years instead. I wasn't about to let them bully me. That night I contacted the lawyer who specialized in property disputes. He was outraged when I showed him my documentation. My lawyer immediately recognized that they had fabricated documents and told me this constituted criminal fraud. Over the next week, I secretly photographed the destruction. They were taking down far more trees than would be needed for an orchard. I noticed the lumber being loaded onto trucks with Redwood Timber Company painted on the sides. With a little digging and help from a former student who now worked at the county records office, I discovered something suspicious. The HOA president's husband was a major stakeholder in Redwood Timber. They weren't building an orchard, they were logging my land for profit and planning to put in a small token orchard afterward. I gathered more evidence. The HOA had never put the orchard project to a community vote. The supposed historical document giving them rights to my land had been created just months ago, and Redwood Timber had made a sizable donation to the HOA's beautification fund just before this all started. Instead of confronting them directly again, I took a different approach. I contacted every local news outlet with my story and evidence. I created a social media page documenting the destruction of the woodland. I reached out to environmental groups about the wildlife being displaced. The story exploded. The local news cameras showed up as the HOA president was supervising the logging operation. The reporter didn't hold back. The reporter directly asked the HOA president if it was true she was profiting personally from logging land that belonged to a retired teacher. The president tried to dismiss the accusation as absurd, insisting it was just a community improvement project. The reporter then pointedly questioned why the lumber was being sold to a company her husband partially owned. Within days, 3 board members resigned. The county prosecutor opened an investigation into fraud and environmental violations. The community members, many of whom had known what was happening, were outraged that their HOA fees had funded this scheme. A month later, the HOA president was facing felony charges for fraud, document forgery, and illegal logging without permits. The remaining board members called for an emergency community vote that resulted in dissolving the HOA entirely. My lawyer negotiated a substantial settlement from both the HOA's insurance and Redwood Timber. It wouldn't bring back my century-old trees, but it was enough to start healing the land. The irony isn't lost on me. The HOA president wanted to build an exclusive amenity that would have been closed to most of the community. Instead, her greed created something better, a truly public space where everyone is welcome and nature is respected. 3 years ago, my wife and I bought 10 acres of land just outside the city limits. We loved the privacy, the space for our dogs to run, and the fact that we could do whatever we wanted with our property. The only downside was that our land bordered a fancy gated community run by a homeowners association. From day one, the homeowners association folks acted like my property was somehow under their jurisdiction. They'd leave notices on my mailbox about my lawn being too tall or complaining about the shed I built. I always threw their notices in the trash since I wasn't part of their community and didn't sign any agreements with them. Things were tense but manageable until last month when they apparently decided my land was the perfect spot for their new green energy initiative. I was working from home that Tuesday when I heard vehicles pulling up my driveway. Looking out the window, I saw 3 SUVs and a truck with solar solutions painted on the side. About 8 people were walking around my property, pointing at different areas and taking measurements. I walked outside confused and annoyed. I asked them what they were doing on my property. A man in an expensive suit stepped forward and introduced himself as the president of the Sunshine Estates Homeowners Association. He explained they were planning the installation of a community solar farm. I was shocked and asked if they meant to install it on my property without even asking me. The suit guy casually confirmed this, saying my land gets the best sunlight exposure in the area. He mentioned the panels would benefit the entire neighborhood, including me, and they were offering to include my home in the power grid. I told him I hadn't agreed to any of this and asked them to leave immediately. That's when a woman in a business outfit joined the conversation. She told me they'd already contracted with Solar Solutions and the project would start next week. She added that I would only need to contribute $15,000 as my portion. I told them they were out of their minds, that I wasn't paying anything, and they weren't putting anything on my property. I reminded them this was private land and they were trespassing. The suit guy responded by telling me not to be difficult. He claimed this was happening whether I liked it or not because the community board had already voted. I had to explain to him that their community board had zero authority over my property and asked them one more time to leave. Instead of leaving, the suit guy stepped closer and jabbed his finger in my chest. He said they had been putting up with my eyesore of a property for years. He threatened that I would cooperate with them on this or things would get very unpleasant for me. Two other men moved toward me with threatening postures. I backed up toward my house and told them they needed to leave right away, adding that my wife was calling the police. The businesswoman smugly told me that the police chief lived in their community and asked who I thought the police would side with. That's when I knew this was getting dangerous. I retreated into my house, told my wife to call 911 immediately, and went to our bedroom to retrieve my hunting rifle. When I returned to the porch, the group was approaching my house. I announced that I had asked them to leave my property and they were trespassing. I said I had the right to defend my home and demanded they back up and leave right now. Most of them looked shocked when they saw the rifle, but suit guy reached under his jacket and pulled out a handgun. He asked if I thought I could threaten them, boasting that they run things around here. He fired a shot that hit the wooden post about 3 feet to my left. The sound echoed through the air, and everyone froze. Before I could react, police sirens wailed in the distance, getting louder by the second. 3 police cars came rushing up my driveway, officers jumping out with weapons drawn. They shouted for everyone to freeze and put down their weapons. I carefully placed my rifle on the porch and raised my hands. Suit guy hesitated but then dropped his handgun. The police separated everyone and took statements. My security cameras had captured the entire incident, from them trespassing to the suit guy firing at me. The officers were stunned when they reviewed the footage. One police officer told me he didn't know what these people had told me, but confirmed my property was completely outside their jurisdiction. He said they had no right to be there, let alone plan construction or demand money. The Homeowners Association members were arrested for trespassing, attempted extortion, and in suit guy's case, attempted murder. It turned out he wasn't even legally carrying that handgun. During the following months, evidence emerged that the Homeowners Association had been planning to use my land to power their community while selling excess electricity back to the grid for profit. They had forged documents claiming they had my consent. I hired a lawyer and sued the Homeowners Association for trespassing, attempted theft, falsifying documents, and emotional distress. Despite their attempts to paint me as an aggressive troublemaker, the security footage and police testimony made the case pretty straightforward. Last week, the judge ruled in my favor, awarding me $1,200,000 in damages. The Homeowners Association has been forced to dissolve, and suit guy is facing 7 years in prison. My wife and I are using part of the money to build a tall fence around our entire property and install an even better security system. The rest is going toward our dream of building a larger house far away from any homeowners association. When I got back home after serving 3 times in Afghanistan as a combat medic, I struggled with serious PTSD and a brain injury. Loud sounds, big crowds, and sudden movements made things worse. That's when Apollo came along, a service dog trained to notice my anxiety before it started and helped me stay calm during flashbacks. We moved to Lakeside Village last year because it seemed perfect. Quiet neighborhood, close to my VA appointments, and within my military pension budget. I did my homework, reviewed the Homeowners Association guidelines, and confirmed that service animals were protected under federal law. What I didn't account for was dealing with people more dangerous than the enemies I'd faced abroad. Entitled HOA Board Members. It started 2 weeks after I moved in. Apollo and I were in the backyard doing some training exercises when someone knocked on my fence gate. The woman at my gate told me that dogs weren't allowed outside in Lakeside Village, claiming it was in the bylaws. I explained that Apollo was my service animal and was protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. She introduced herself as the HOA president and insisted their rules clearly stated no outdoor pets to maintain their pristine aesthetic standards, demanding I keep him inside. I compared it to telling someone they couldn't take their wheelchair outside since Apollo wasn't a pet, but a medical device. The HOA president didn't appreciate my comparison and warned me not to get snippy with her, saying rules were rules and that she'd be sending an official notice. 3 days later, I received a certified letter claiming multiple neighbors had filed noise complaints about incessant barking. This was impossible. Apollo is trained never to bark unless there's a legitimate threat. He hadn't barked once since we moved in. I appealed to the HOA board, bringing Apollo's certification papers, a letter from my VA psychiatrist, and citations of federal law. The meeting was a farce. The treasurer acknowledged what he called my situation but claimed other homeowners had rights too, mentioning they'd received 15 complaints about barking. When I asked to see these complaints, the secretary refused, saying that was confidential information. I insisted Apollo doesn't bark and is specially trained not to. The HOA president accused me of calling them liars and suggested Lakeside Village might not be the right community for me, giving me 30 days to rehome Apollo or face daily fines of $200. I contacted a veterans advocacy lawyer who sent them a cease and desist letter, citing the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. Their response was to escalate. One morning, a man in an ill-fitting suit showed up at my door. The man introduced himself as being from County Noise Inspection Services, claiming they'd received multiple complaints about a dog on my premises. He flashed a badge so quickly I couldn't read it, and tried to push past me into my home. When I asked if he had a warrant, he claimed he didn't need one because HOA bylaws gave them inspection rights. I told him that's not how the law works and asked him to leave my property. After he left, I called the county office. They had no such department as County Noise Inspection Services. That night, I heard barking coming from my yard at 2 a.m. Apollo was sleeping next to my bed, completely silent. I installed motion-activated cameras around my property that night. The next day, I found small wireless speakers hidden in the bushes near my fence. The cameras had caught the HOA president and secretary planting them at 1 a.m. The barking continued for 5 more nights. Each morning I collected more speakers. I documented everything and set up sound detection equipment that recorded decibel levels and direction. The HOA sent me a final notice: rehome the dog or face eviction proceedings and liens on my property. They scheduled a final hearing where I was to surrender Apollo. I showed up with my lawyer. The boardroom was packed with HOA members I'd never seen before. The HOA president began the meeting by addressing the ongoing violations by the homeowner in Unit 47, but I interrupted before she could continue. I told everyone I'd like to play something for them. I connected my phone to their meeting room speakers and played the recording. The HOA board in their previous closed meeting. The recording revealed their true intentions. They called me a crazy vet who was becoming a problem, questioning who I thought I was bringing a mutt into their community. They questioned if the Americans with Disabilities Act applied to HOAs, with someone suggesting it wouldn't if they claimed it was a noise issue. They openly discussed gaslighting me until I thought I was crazy. They mentioned having someone named Tom pose as a county inspector and instructed others to plant speakers that night, making sure they were hidden well. They even planned to file a restraining order if I fought back, confident no judge would side with a mentally unstable veteran against an entire community. The room fell silent. The HOA lawyer, who had been smirking throughout the meeting, turned white. The HOA lawyer tried to adjourn the meeting, saying he needed to speak with the board privately. I told him it was too late, explaining that the recording was already online, along with videos of his clients planting speakers on my property. I told everyone that the Department of Justice had opened an investigation for discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and my lawyer had filed a civil suit. The fallout was swift. The Department of Justice investigation revealed a pattern of discrimination against various homeowners, including elderly and disabled residents. The court ordered the HOA to be disbanded and restructured under court supervision. Each board member was personally fined, with total damages reaching $500,000. I used my portion of the settlement to establish a nonprofit organization that provides legal assistance to veterans and disabled individuals fighting discriminatory housing practices. Apollo and I now travel to speak at community events about disability rights and housing discrimination. And yes, Apollo gets to enjoy the backyard as much as he wants. Turns out the only ones disturbing the peace were the entitled people running the HOA. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.